I had been struggling for months, perhaps even years, feeling completely overwhelmed by the weight of my circumstances. Life seemed like a series of unending battles, and I was exhausted. Financial issues loomed large, my relationships were fraying, and a deep sense of loneliness began to creep into my heart. Every day felt like I was trudging through quicksand, struggling to keep my head above water. Despite my best efforts, nothing seemed to improve. I had tried everything I could think of, working harder, reaching out to friends, and even seeking professional help, but nothing changed. My spirit was defeated, and the light at the end of the tunnel seemed as distant as ever. It was during this period of darkness that I found myself praying more often. There were moments when I cried out to God, desperate for any form of comfort or guidance. I remember one evening, feeling completely drained and at the end of my rope, when I silently begged God for a sign. "Please," I whispered, "show me that I'm not alone in this. Show me that there is a way out." I didn't expect an answer, but somewhere deep inside, I still held onto a flicker of hope. Little did I know, this was the beginning of a miraculous change in my life, one that would come in the most unexpected way. The days had started to blend together, each one a mirror image of the last. I had tried to keep my hope alive, but the constant weight of my struggles was slowly eroding it. Every time I thought I might see a glimmer of light, it would quickly fade into disappointment. My debts were piling up, my job was no longer fulfilling, and my relationships had suffered. I could feel myself becoming bitter, consumed by frustration. The anger I had bottled up inside started seeping out, affecting those around me. Friends and family had started to drift away, unable to relate to my constant negativity. I knew I needed something, anything, to change. Yet, nothing seemed to shift, and my life felt like an endless cycle of failure. It was in these moments of complete vulnerability, with my back against the wall, that I reached out to God again. My prayers were no longer just about asking for help, but begging for understanding. Why am I going through this? I wondered. What am I missing? My soul was crying for something more, but I had no idea that God had already heard my cries. I had almost given up hope, but deep down, I still believed that God would answer me. I just didn't know how. I had always believed in the power of prayer, but in that moment, it felt like my prayers were the only thing holding me together. That night, I fell to my knees, my heart heavy with despair. I had been carrying so much pain for so long that I felt like I couldn't breathe under its weight. I closed my eyes, trying to quiet the racing thoughts in my head. "God, I need you," I whispered. "I can't do this on my own anymore. Please show me a way out." I didn't know what I was asking for, but I knew that I couldn't keep living this way. I felt small and powerless, and yet, somehow, I held on to a sliver of faith that God could help me. It was a desperate prayer, full of raw emotion, but also a silent plea for hope. As I sat there, the silence of the room was deafening, and for a moment, I feared that no answer would come. I felt as though I was speaking into an empty void. Yet, even in that silence, I sensed a small flicker of warmth and peace that seemed to wash over me, if only for a moment. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but it felt as though something beyond the ordinary had entered the space. There was no dramatic vision, no audible voice, but there was a sense of calm, a reassurance that I was being heard. That night, as I finished praying, I had no idea what the future held, but I knew that I was not alone in my struggle. The next morning, the sun seemed brighter, but it wasn't a drastic change, it was subtle. The day started like any other, with the weight of my responsibilities still hanging over me. I had no idea that today would be different, but as I was sitting in my living room, going over my bills once again, I heard a knock at the door. It was unexpected, no one had been scheduled to visit, and I wasn't expecting any deliveries. My heart skipped a beat, uncertain of who could be calling. I wasn't sure whether I was even in the mood to answer. But something urged me to get up and open the door, as though an unseen force was guiding me. When I opened the door, I was taken aback. There stood a man, well dressed in simple but neat clothing. He had a serene expression on his face, and there was something about his presence that made me feel at ease, even though I didn't know him. He didn't appear anxious or in a rush, he just stood there, calmly waiting. "Hello," he said with a gentle smile, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I was wondering if I could talk with you for a moment. There was no urgency, no sign of distress. The man simply seemed to want to engage, and his demeanor was so calming that I couldn't help but invite him in. I hesitated for a second, unsure of what was happening. There was something about the man's presence that felt familiar, yet entirely unfamiliar. I was accustomed to keeping to myself, especially with all the stress and worry in my life, but something compelled me to invite him in. It wasn't just politeness, it was as though my heart was telling me to trust him. "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. As he walked into my living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary encounter. There was a strange, almost magical quality to his calmness. I expected him to sit and ask for something, but instead he simply asked if he could talk with me. His voice was soothing, and the sincerity in his eyes made me feel as though I had known him forever, even though I was sure we had never met. He didn't introduce himself immediately, but there was a quiet understanding between us. It was as though he knew I was struggling without having to say a word. For a moment, I wondered if he had come to sell something, but his demeanor wasn't that of a salesman. Instead, he spoke of the world around us, life, faith, and the human experience. He didn't talk to me as if I were a stranger, but as if he was there to offer something I had been missing. As we talked, the weight in my chest seemed to lighten, and I found myself sharing things I hadn't been able to express to anyone else. I had no idea who this man was or where he had come from, but for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel so alone. The stranger's calm demeanor was unlike anything I had ever encountered. His words flowed easily, and he spoke with such confidence and kindness that I couldn't help but be drawn in. There was something comforting about his presence, like a soothing balm on an aching wound. It was as though he had an innate understanding of the struggles I was facing, and his every word seemed to offer a piece of the puzzle I had been trying to solve for so long. He didn't rush me or interrupt my thoughts. Instead, he listened intently, as if he had all the time in the world. I felt heard, truly heard, for the first time in ages. There was a quiet power in his presence. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a grand statement. Everything about him seemed to emanate peace. It was impossible not to feel at ease around him, despite my turbulent emotions. In that moment, I started to believe that this encounter was something more than mere coincidence. There was a sense that he was exactly what I needed at that very moment. A guide, a helper, a source of divine wisdom. But I couldn't quite put my finger on why or how he seemed to know exactly what I needed to hear. As the conversation continued, I felt a warmth in my chest that grew stronger with every word he spoke, and for the first time in a long while, I began to feel hopeful again. These first 6 expanded points provide a deeper, more detailed look into the initial stages of the protagonist's life transformation, setting up the stage for the unfolding mystery of the stranger's true identity and purpose. Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the rest of the story. As the conversation continued, I began to notice that there was something very different about this man. He didn't speak like anyone I had ever met before. His words seemed to penetrate deep into my heart, touching places I didn't even know were there. He didn't offer any empty platitudes or try to fix everything at once. Instead, he spoke with such wisdom, as if he had lived through all the trials I was facing, and yet had found a way to remain peaceful and joyful. There was no judgment in his voice, only understanding and compassion. Every time I shared my fears and struggles, he responded with gentle reassurance, but it wasn't just his words, it was the energy around him, something unexplainable that made me feel at ease. At one point, he asked me to reflect on my life, encouraging me to consider not only the difficulties but also the moments of joy and gratitude that I had overlooked. Even in the darkest times, God is with you, he said softly. You are not alone in your journey. His words resonated in ways I couldn't fully comprehend, but they began to heal a part of me that had been hurting for so long. As I listened, I realized how much I had been focusing on my problems and ignoring the smaller blessings in my life. It wasn't that my troubles vanished, but the way I viewed them started to shift. I could feel a sense of peace slowly replacing the overwhelming sense of despair I had been carrying for so long. The stranger's wisdom wasn't the kind that comes from formal education or years of study. It was the kind of wisdom that seemed to flow from a deeper source, one that I couldn't quite grasp. It felt ancient and timeless, as though he had known the answers to life's hardest questions long before I even began to ask them. He spoke of faith in God, not as a distant concept, but as something real and active in our daily lives. His words were simple, yet profound, and each sentence seemed to offer a new layer of understanding. He talked about trusting God's plan for us, even when we couldn't see it. Sometimes, he said, we don't understand why things happen the way they do. But we have to trust that there is a greater purpose, even when we can't see it right away. His words struck a chord deep inside of me. I had always struggled with faith, especially when things were going wrong. It was hard to believe in a higher plan when my life seemed to be falling apart. But as the stranger spoke, I began to feel a shift inside. It was as if he was awakening something inside me that had been dormant, something I had buried under layers of doubt and fear. For the first time in a long while, I felt a tiny flicker of trust. Maybe there was more to this life than what I could see with my eyes. Maybe, just maybe, there was a purpose to all the pain and struggles I had endured. At the end of our conversation, the stranger stood up as if he were about to leave. But before he did, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He handed it to me with a kind smile and said, "I have something for you. This is not just a gift, but a message. Open it when you're ready." I took the envelope, confused but also intrigued. It wasn't the kind of gesture I had expected. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about the envelope. It looked like any ordinary letter. But there was something about the way the stranger gave it to me that made it feel special, almost sacred. I was about to ask him what it was when he gently placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "God has already answered your prayers. You just need to listen." With that, he turned and walked out of the door, leaving me in a state of awe and wonder. I stood there, holding the envelope, unsure of what to do. What was this message? What did he mean by "God has already answered your prayers"? I was overwhelmed with emotions, curiosity, gratitude, and a sense of anticipation. Part of me wanted to open the envelope right away, but another part of me felt like it was something I should save for a special moment. I placed it on the table and sat down, my mind racing. It felt like I had just experienced something extraordinary, but I wasn't sure if I fully understood it yet. After reading the message, I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by a sense of calm and clarity. It was as though everything I had been struggling with, every doubt, every worry, had suddenly lifted. I closed my eyes, taking in the peace that now filled the room. I couldn't explain it, but it was undeniable. In that moment, I felt the presence of God more strongly than I ever had before. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was as if God himself had entered the room and was wrapping his arms around me, letting me know that everything would be okay. The fear that had consumed me for so long melted away, replaced by an unwavering sense of peace. I no longer felt alone in my struggles. I sat there in silence for what seemed like hours, not because I was waiting for something to happen, but because I felt a deep connection to something greater than myself. The world outside didn't seem as important anymore, and the issues I had once thought were insurmountable now seemed much smaller. The stranger had been a messenger, but the real gift was the profound sense of God's presence that I now felt in my life. It was as if the floodgates had opened, and I was finally able to receive the grace and peace I had been seeking for so long. From that moment on, I knew that I wasn't alone, and that everything would unfold according to God's perfect plan. As I sat there, still overwhelmed by the message and the peace that had filled my heart, something began to feel strange. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than before, yet it was as though I was in a state of suspended time. It wasn't until I stood up to gather my thoughts that I realized something even stranger. The stranger had left without a trace. His car was nowhere in sight. There were no footsteps in the snow outside. It was as if he had simply vanished, leaving no evidence that he had ever been there. I tried to rationalize it, thinking that perhaps he had simply slipped away quietly, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. He had arrived out of nowhere, offered me wisdom, and then disappeared as mysteriously as he had come. I stood in my living room, staring at the door, still unsure what to make of everything that had just happened. Could it be that I had imagined the whole encounter? Was I so desperate for help that my mind had created an illusion? But then I remembered the envelope, the message that had been inside. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. The words were real. The comfort I had felt, the peace that had settled over me, was real. There was no denying it. It was at that moment that I realized the truth. This stranger was no ordinary man. He had been sent by God, an angel in human form, to help me find my way out of the darkness I had been lost in for so long. And just as mysteriously as he had come, he had left, knowing that his mission had been accomplished. The next few days were filled with reflection. I couldn't stop thinking about the message I had received from the stranger. Trust in God's timing. Everything will be okay. At first, I had struggled to understand the full depth of what those words meant. They seemed so simple, yet in their simplicity, they carried so much weight. I had spent so many years trying to control every aspect of my life, always striving to fix things on my own. I had resisted the idea of surrendering to a higher power, believing that if I didn't take charge, nothing would ever get better. But now, I was beginning to realize that my way wasn't working. I had been living in a constant state of anxiety, trying to make everything happen on my own terms, and it had only led to disappointment. As I thought about the message, I started to let go of the need to control everything. I began to understand that trusting in God's timing meant having faith that the right things would happen at the right time. It didn't mean sitting back and doing nothing, but rather trusting that when I took action, it would align with God's plan for me. The more I meditated on these thoughts, the more peace I felt. My life didn't have to be a constant struggle. I could allow myself to trust that God was with me, guiding me every step of the way. And with this newfound trust came a sense of freedom. I no longer felt burdened by the weight of trying to make everything happen on my own. Over time, the sense of purpose I had been searching for began to emerge. Before the stranger's visit, I had felt adrift, unsure of my place in the world. I had struggled with feelings of inadequacy, believing that I was not capable of achieving the dreams I had once had. But now, as I embraced the message of trusting in God's timing, I began to see things differently. I understood that my purpose wasn't something I had to chase after relentlessly. It wasn't about forcing myself into a particular mold or striving to meet societal expectations. It was about embracing who I truly was and trusting that my path would unfold in God's perfect timing. Each day, I became more attuned to the small moments of clarity and guidance that appeared in my life. I began to notice opportunities one had overlooked before, relationships that needed healing, passions I had abandoned, and a deep desire to help others that had always been buried within me. My perspective shifted, and I realized that my purpose was to live authentically, with faith, love, and compassion. I didn't need to have everything figured out right away. God had a plan for me, and as long as I trusted in His timing, everything would fall into place. This new sense of purpose gave me strength and a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. With the peace that had settled in my heart, I began to focus on what I was truly grateful for. For so long, I had allowed myself to dwell on what I lacked or what wasn't working in my life. I had been consumed by what I thought was missing, whether it was success, love, or happiness. But now, as I reflected on everything I had received, I realized how much I had taken for granted. I had a roof over my head, food on the table, and the love of family and friends who supported me through thick and thin. Most importantly, I had been given the gift of a deeper connection to God and the guidance I had so desperately needed. Every morning, I started to make it a habit to count my blessings. Whether it was the kindness of a stranger, the laughter of my children, or the beauty of a sunset, I found something to be thankful for every single day. This practice of gratitude transformed my outlook on life. It shifted my focus from scarcity to abundance. I no longer felt as though I was lacking, but instead, I recognized that I was surrounded by love, grace, and blessings beyond measure. Gratitude became the lens through which I viewed the world, and in turn, it deepened my faith and strengthened my resolve to trust in God's plan for me. As the weeks passed, I began to notice significant changes in my life. The anxiety and stress that had once ruled my days seemed to dissipate. I felt lighter, more at peace with myself and my circumstances. The healing power of faith had begun to take root in my heart, and I no longer felt like a victim of my circumstances. I understood that faith wasn't about never having difficulties, but about trusting that no matter what challenges came my way, God would be with me every step of the way. I became more patient with myself and others. I stopped rushing through life, constantly trying to fix things, and instead, I allowed myself to trust the process. I understood that healing, both physically and emotionally, took time. But as I deepened my connection to God, I found that the healing process wasn't as painful as it once seemed. It was a journey of growth and self-discovery, and with each passing day, I felt more whole. My life was no longer defined by fear and uncertainty, but by the peace and strength that came from trusting in God's love and grace. A few months after the stranger's visit, I began to feel like I was truly living the life I was meant to. My faith had grown, and my life was moving in a positive direction. Yet, one evening as I was preparing dinner, I heard a knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it to find the stranger standing there once again. His presence was just as calming and reassuring as the first time. He smiled at me, and there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, as though he knew what I had been through since our last encounter. I invited him in, grateful for his unexpected visit. He sat down at my kitchen table, and we began talking, just like we had months before. But this time, our conversation felt different. It was deeper. We discussed faith, life, and the lessons I had learned over the past months. The more I listened to him, the more I realized that I wasn't just speaking with a man. There was something special about him, something otherworldly. His words were wise, and his presence had a profound effect on my soul. It was as though God had sent him once more, not just to check on me, but to remind me of the importance of remaining rooted in faith and trust. The conversation soon shifted to the future. The stranger spoke of hope, of challenges yet to come, and of the importance of perseverance. He reminded me that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but if I stayed faithful, I would be able to overcome whatever obstacles lay in my path. His words were not filled with promises of a perfect life, but with the truth that life would always have ups and downs. What mattered was how I responded to those challenges. I felt a renewed sense of purpose as he spoke, understanding that no matter how difficult things became, God's guidance would always be there, leading me through. With each word he spoke, my heart filled with a sense of peace and confidence that I had never experienced before. It was as though the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders, and I no longer feared the future. I knew that, no matter what came my way, I would be strong enough to handle it. The stranger's visit was a powerful reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. God's love never falters, and with faith, anything is possible. One day, I found myself facing a challenge that seemed insurmountable. The stress and fear crept back in as I struggled with the situation. It was then that I remembered the stranger's words, "Trust in God's timing. Everything will be okay." I took a deep breath and decided to put my trust in God once again. Almost immediately, something incredible happened. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a series of events unfolded that provided a solution to my problem. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to offer help, and the situation that had seemed impossible was resolved in ways I couldn't have planned. It was clear to me that this was no coincidence. God had intervened, answering my prayers in a way that I never could have anticipated. I could feel the weight lift off my shoulders as I realized that I didn't have to carry the burden alone. I was not in control of everything, but God was. And when I trusted in His plan, everything fell into place. I was reminded once again that I wasn't alone in my struggles, that God was always there, guiding me, providing for me, and answering my prayers in ways I couldn't always see at the time. With the experience of the stranger and the profound changes in my life, I felt compelled to share my story. I wanted others to know that God's presence is real and that He sends help when we need it most. I began to speak to my friends and family about my encounter, telling them about the stranger who had come to me at a time of deep need and the lasting impact it had on my life. My story was met with awe and curiosity, as people seemed to be drawn to the message of hope and faith that it carried. As I shared my story, I noticed that others started to open up about their own experiences with divine intervention. Many had felt the presence of God in their lives, whether through a stranger's kindness, an unexpected event, or a feeling of peace that had guided them through difficult times. It was as if the telling of my story had sparked something in others, a reminder that we are never alone in our struggles. Through this, I found a sense of purpose in sharing what I had learned, knowing that it might offer someone else the hope and encouragement they needed to keep going. As the months passed, I found my connection to God deepening in ways I hadn't expected. I had always believed in Him, but now my faith was more than just a belief. It was a living, breathing part of my everyday life. I started to read the Bible more regularly, seeking wisdom and comfort in its pages. Prayer became a natural part of my routine, and I found that I could turn to God at any moment for strength, guidance, or simply to express gratitude. This deeper spiritual connection brought a sense of peace that was unparalleled. I no longer felt the need to control everything or to worry about the future. I had learned to surrender my anxieties to God, trusting that He would take care of me. My life, once filled with uncertainty and fear, was now centered around faith, and it made all the difference. I had come to understand that, no matter what I faced, God's love and guidance would always be there to carry me through. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected phone call from a long-lost relative. It had been years since I had heard from them, and I wondered what prompted them to reach out now. As we caught up, they revealed that they had recently encountered a financial windfall and felt compelled to share their good fortune with me. They offered to help with some of the bills I had been struggling to pay. Overwhelmed with gratitude, I realized that God had been working through them, just as He had worked through the stranger who had visited me months earlier. This blessing came at just the right time, when I had been feeling anxious about my financial future. It was as though God had orchestrated this moment, providing for me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The stranger had given me the encouragement to trust in God's timing, and now I saw the fulfillment of that lesson. I was reminded that God works through others to bless us, and even when we can't see how, He is always making a way. This moment of unexpected grace reinforced my belief that I was never alone and that God's love was always surrounding me. With each passing day, I began to feel a renewed sense of purpose in my life. I had been so focused on surviving, on getting through the tough times, that I had forgotten to live with intention. Now, thanks to the stranger's visit and the blessings that followed, I had learned that life wasn't just about overcoming challenges, it was about living with purpose and using the strength God had given me to help others. I began volunteering at a local shelter, offering my time and support to those who were struggling, just as I had. The more I gave, the more I felt fulfilled. It became clear to me that God had not only sent the stranger to help me, but to help me discover my true purpose. By helping others, I was able to make a difference in their lives, just as the stranger had made a difference in mine. I understood now that life wasn't just about receiving, it was about giving and being a vessel for God's love and light in the world. This renewed sense of purpose gave me the strength to face any challenge with grace and hope. Looking back on everything I had experienced, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey I had been on had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. From the dark days of loneliness and fear to the moment the stranger appeared at my door, I had witnessed the hand of God guiding me every step of the way. Through the stranger, I had found faith, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. I had learned to trust in God's plan even when I couldn't see the way forward. In reflecting on this journey, I realized that my faith had grown in ways I never imagined. I was no longer the person I had been before. I was stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected to God. I knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, I was prepared to face them with faith and resilience. And I would always remember the stranger who had appeared at my door, the angel who had been sent to show me the way. My life had been forever changed, and I was filled with gratitude for every lesson learned along the way. The stranger never came back after that second visit. As time passed, I began to wonder if he had been more than just a man. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been an angel sent by God, a messenger of hope during a time when I desperately needed it. His visits had left an indelible mark on my heart, and though I never saw him again, I knew that his presence had been a divine intervention. I began to trust more in the unseen, in the ways that God works behind the scenes to guide and protect us. As I moved forward in life, I carried his message with me: trust in God's plan, embrace the challenges, and never lose hope. I knew that the stranger had come into my life for a reason, and though our paths had crossed only briefly, the impact of his visit would stay with me forever. Sometimes, the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected places, and I was grateful that God had sent an angel to show me that even in my darkest moments, I was never truly alone. Years have passed since that life-changing encounter, but the lessons I learned from the stranger have stayed with me. My faith has only grown stronger, and I've continued to live with the purpose and hope that I found in the aftermath of that visit. I've faced new challenges, of course, but each one has only reaffirmed the truth that God's timing is always perfect. I now see how God was at work in every detail of my life, orchestrating the events and people who would lead me to this place of peace and purpose. I continue to share my story with others, hoping that it will inspire them to trust in God, to be open to the unexpected, and to recognize the divine interventions that occur in their own lives. I know that the stranger was sent to me not only to help me but to remind me that God is always present, working in ways we cannot always see but always feel. My heart is filled with gratitude for the angel who saved me, and I now live with the confidence that, no matter what happens, God is always with me. As time went on, the experience with the stranger began to shape my everyday perspective. I no longer saw life through the lens of fear or doubt. I began to look at each day as an opportunity to experience God's presence and to live out His teachings. Even in moments of difficulty, I could find peace knowing that God had a plan. This shift in perspective didn't happen overnight, but with each passing day, I found myself more able to embrace the challenges of life with grace, knowing I wasn't alone. When difficult situations arose, I no longer panicked or felt overwhelmed. Instead, I paused, took a deep breath, and reminded myself that God was with me, guiding me through every obstacle. I remembered the stranger's words about trusting in God's plan, and those words became my mantra. Life felt more manageable, and my heart was lighter. The lessons I had learned from the stranger stayed with me, becoming a steady foundation upon which I could build my future. As my life continued to change, I felt a calling to help others discover the hope and faith I had found. I started volunteering more, offering encouragement and support to people in my community who were struggling. I realized that my experience wasn't just for me, it was something I could share with others to uplift them. Every person I met who was going through a tough time reminded me of where I had been, and I knew I could offer them the same comfort and support that had been given to me. One day, I encountered a woman who was in a situation similar to the one I had found myself in not long ago. She was overwhelmed by the challenges she was facing and didn't know where to turn. I shared my story with her, the story of the stranger who had appeared at my door and changed my life. I spoke about the importance of trusting in God's timing and the power of hope. As I spoke, I saw the light in her eyes begin to return. She realized she wasn't alone, and that God was there, just as He had been for me. Helping others find hope became one of the most fulfilling aspects of my life. Though I hadn't seen the stranger in years, his message continued to echo in my heart. I found myself revisiting his words time and time again. Trust in God's timing. Everything will be okay. It wasn't just a passing moment of inspiration, it was a life lesson that had become a guiding principle. I began to understand that God's plan for each of us unfolds in His time, and we must trust that His timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own desires. As I grew older, I came to realize that I wasn't just living for myself. My life was part of a much larger story, one where God's guidance and love connected me to others. The stranger's message was about surrendering to that greater plan, letting go of control, and finding peace in the knowing that God is always working behind the scenes. The stranger's visit was a gift, a moment of divine intervention that had changed my life forever. And with each passing day, I tried to live in a way that honored the lesson I had learned from him. One day, years after I had first met the stranger, something unexpected happened. I was walking through a park when I noticed a man sitting on a bench. There was something about him that immediately caught my attention. His presence was familiar, yet I couldn't quite place it. As I walked closer, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me, and I knew, without a doubt, that it was him. The stranger who had visited me all those years ago was sitting right there, looking as calm and serene as he had that first day. I approached him cautiously, unsure of how to react. He turned to me with a gentle smile, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stood still. His eyes were filled with the same wisdom and warmth that had comforted me during our first encounter. Without saying a word, he nodded as if to acknowledge that I had learned the lessons he had come to share. Then, as mysteriously as he had appeared, he stood up, gave me one final, reassuring look, and walked away. I never saw him again, but in that moment, I understood. The stranger had come to fulfill his purpose, and now his work was done. His message had been received, and I was ready to carry it forward. After my final encounter with the stranger, I felt an even deeper sense of responsibility to live out the lessons I had learned. I had been given so much faith, hope, guidance, and now it was my turn to pass it on. I began to take more intentional steps to embody the faith I had developed. I started volunteering at local shelters, speaking at churches, and offering support to those in need. My heart was filled with a desire to serve, not out of obligation, but because I truly believed that this was what I was meant to do. It wasn't always easy. There were times when I felt overwhelmed, unsure of whether I was making a difference. But then I would remember the stranger's words and his visit to my door, and I would press on. Every small act of kindness, every moment of support, felt like a way of honoring the lessons I had been taught. I knew that my purpose wasn't just about receiving blessings, it was about sharing those blessings with others. Through my actions, I could be a light in someone else's darkness, just as the stranger had been for me. Over time, I began to see the ripple effect of the stranger's visit. The people I had helped, the lives I had touched, all seemed to be finding their own paths of healing and hope. One woman I had helped started volunteering herself, sharing her story and offering comfort to others who were struggling. A man I had counseled began a support group for others facing similar challenges, spreading the message of faith and hope. It was clear to me that the stranger's influence had extended far beyond me. I realized that the stranger had not just saved me from despair, he had ignited a chain reaction of kindness and faith that would continue long after his visit. It was as though he had planted a seed in my heart, and now that seed was bearing fruit, growing into something beautiful. The stranger's message had become a living, breathing reality in the lives of others. And though I never saw him again, his presence remained in the stories of those he had touched through me. Years later, as I sat in my living room reflecting on the journey I had been on, I noticed something extraordinary. A small, old family Bible, which had been sitting untouched on my shelf for years, suddenly fell off its perch with a soft thud. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then I noticed that the Bible had opened to a specific passage, Psalm 91 verse 11, "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways." I felt a wave of peace wash over me as I realized that this was not a random event. It was another sign that the stranger, perhaps an angel, had been sent by God, and that he was still watching over me, guiding my life. I took that as a reminder of the constant protection God offers to his children. The verse seemed to confirm that the stranger's presence in my life had been no accident. It was part of a larger plan, one in which God had sent a messenger to save me and guide me through my struggles. Even though the stranger was no longer physically in my life, I knew that God's angels continued to watch over me, offering guidance and protection. This revelation reaffirmed my faith and reminded me that God's care for his people is ever present, even in the most unexpected forms. The more I reflected on the stranger's visit, the more I realized that I had a responsibility to live out my faith with greater conviction. My relationship with God had grown deeper, but I now wanted to take it even further. I committed to spending more time in prayer and reflection, seeking God's guidance in every aspect of my life. I also felt a calling to speak out more about the role that faith had played in transforming my life, particularly through the stranger's visit. I knew that sharing my story could inspire others to have faith, especially when they felt hopeless or alone. I began attending church more regularly, joining Bible study groups, and getting involved in church activities. My faith was no longer just a part of my life. It became the center of it. I wanted to be a living example of how God can transform lives, even in the most difficult times. I knew that the stranger's visit had been a pivotal moment in my spiritual journey, and I felt an overwhelming desire to honor that moment by deepening my relationship with God and helping others to find hope in their own struggles. As I continued to live out my newfound commitment to faith, I encountered more challenges in life. There were moments of loss, confusion, and hardship, but I had developed a deeper trust in God's plan for me. No longer did I question why things happened or feel overwhelmed by life's obstacles. Instead, I relied on the strength that God had given me. I knew that just as He had provided for me during my darkest days, He would continue to do so. The stranger had shown me that God's faithfulness never wavers, and I clung to that truth during times of difficulty. There were times when it felt like I was facing an uphill battle, but I never lost sight of the lessons I had learned. I would often return to the memory of that stranger at my door and the peace I had felt in his presence. God had been faithful then, and He would be faithful now. This unwavering belief in God's faithfulness became a cornerstone of my life. It was not about having a trouble-free life, but about knowing that, with God by my side, I could face anything that came my way.